On est parti. Alors, bonjour à toutes et tous. Bienvenue à notre conférence organisée dans le cadre du festival Go Vélo Montréal. Mon nom est Magali Bebron, je suis directrice des programmes chez Vélo Québec. Je serai aujourd'hui votre maître de cérémonie pour introduire notre conférencière internationale qui nous a fait l'honneur d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui, Anna Zivarts. Notre conférence se tient en mode hybride. On est une cinquantaine de personnes ici présentes physiquement à Montréal, à l'Esplanade Tranquille. Et vous êtes également une quarantaine à nous écouter en ligne. Merci à toutes et tous d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. On va tâcher de bien organiser pour que tout le monde puisse participer, que vous soyez en présence ou en ligne. Donc, cette conférence s'inscrit dans le cadre de la programmation du festival Go Vélo Montréal qui a débuté dimanche dernier avec le défi métropolitain et qui se poursuit ce vendredi avec le Tour la nuit et dimanche, bien sûr, avec le Tour de l'île. Le festival Go Vélo Montréal est un événement cycliste d'une semaine présenté par Le Lait en collaboration avec Desjardins. Nous remercions également notre commanditaire associé Sport Expert. Enfin, le festival bénéficie bien sûr aussi du soutien du gouvernement du Québec, de la Ville de Montréal et de Tourisme Montréal. Merci à nos partenaires de rendre possible cette magnifique célébration du vélo et de la culture cyclable de Montréal. Alors, pour commencer, quelques informations pratiques. La conférence d'Anna durera environ 1 heure et comprendra des portions interactives où Anna vous invitera à partager vos expériences. On aura aussi besoin de volontaires pour lire certains témoignages ou certaines questions qui s'afficheront à l'écran pour nous assurer que nos auditeurs et nos auditrices en ligne profitent du tout. Mes collègues Julien et Louis s'assureront de vous faire parvenir un micro dans la salle. Donc, manifestez-vous, soyez bons joueurs, participez. Et les participants en ligne, pour leur part, pourront nous partager leurs propres expériences dans le module de clavardage. Je me ferai votre porte-parole pour les lire et les partager à l'ensemble des participants qui sont dans la salle avec nous pour le bénéfice de tous. À l'issue de la conférence, nous aurons également une période de questions pour le public. Pour celles et ceux qui sont en ligne, je vous invite à utiliser l'outil de questions-réponses QR en français, Q&A en anglais, du Zoom pour inscrire ces questions. Vous pouvez les inscrire au fur et à mesure et on s'assurera de les poser à Anna. Sentez-vous à l'aise également de les poser en français au besoin. On pourra s'assurer de fournir la traduction pour que Anna puisse y répondre. Et en ligne, il y a également une transcription en français pour permettre à tout le monde de bien profiter du contenu. À la fin de la conférence, nous aurons également un nombre limité de livres de Anna qui sont en vente au fond de la salle et elle pourra même vous les dédicacer. Elle a son petit stylo avec elle. Donc, entrons maintenant dans le vif du sujet. Anna Zivarts est militante pour les droits des personnes handicapées et directrice de la Disability Mobility Initiative de Disability Rights Washington. À travers ses recherches, son plaidoyer et son activisme, elle donne la parole aux personnes qui ne conduisent pas et milite pour des systèmes de transport plus justes, plus accessibles et plus humains. Anna, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to come to Montreal. The stage is yours.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me. And I wish I could do this in French. I took a little French in college, and I'm going to turn off my sound here real quick. You don't want to hear me speak French. So thank you for putting up with me speaking in English. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you for hosting me. I'll start, and I'm going to do something tonight that may be a little unfamiliar to you. I'm going to try to describe verbally the visual images on my slides. And this is a practice of accessibility for folks who are low vision or blind, or maybe folks who are online and just able to listen, which I've definitely, as a parent, been in that situation where I'm trying to listen to a Zoom meeting while getting my kid what he needs at night. So bear with me as I do that. So this first slide has a cover of the book, When Driving is Not an Option. It's got a lovely black and white line drawing on it that was actually drawn by a friend of mine who is also low vision, who has the same eye condition I do. And it's a picture of some folks waiting for the bus. And then there's how to reach me. You can find me on LinkedIn, non-driver on Blue Sky, and weekwithoutdriving.org is a website I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So a little bit more about me. Why am I here? How did I get here in front of you all tonight? This picture on the left is me as a little kid learning how to ride a bike. As I mentioned, I'm low vision. I have a condition called nystagmus, and I actually do have a white cane with me tonight, and sometimes I pop it out, especially when I'm in a big room, because it's important, I think, for you to know and just to be reminded that I can't necessarily see you. I see kind of a blur of crowd, and so if I'm not making eye contact, that's why, and that's why I have some lovely folks who are going to run the mic for me and be the people who call on you. And I'm also going to ask you a favor because I have some quotes up on the screen, and I can't necessarily read that font size, and so I'm going to have you read those quotes for me out loud so we can all hear it, and then you'll get to share a little bit about your own experience. So that's me as a kid. I grew up in Washington State. The picture on the upper left is the road I grew up on, so you can see it's pretty rural, tall trees, no sidewalks, no shoulder, no bus stops. And growing up there, I just assumed everyone drove everywhere. That was, normal, and that's how people got around. And I didn't know adults who didn't do that. And I, at 16, went to the DMV, to try to get my driver's license, and I failed the vision test. And I was not deterred, and I had my friend try to teach me how to drive anyway. And we went to a parking lot at night, in the rain, in her mom's truck, which I don't know if she was supposed to be driving. I was definitely not supposed to be driving. And I drove it up a tree. And we were okay, but the truck was not. And we spent the rest of the summer clearing blackberries for her mom to pay it off. And that's when I realized, okay, I am not going to be able to drive. And I need to figure out a way to live a full life. And what that looked like for me was moving to New York City. And so this picture on the bottom right is New York City. There's a bunch of people, I think, just sort of walking across the street against the light. And I moved to New York City because I had heard that there was a subway system, and that subway ran 24 hours a day. And that, as a young person in my 20s, that was the most appealing thing to me, because I wanted that same freedom that my friends in, growing up in Washington State had, that they could, get themselves home from a party at 1 a.m. and not have to ask for a ride, not have to ask for a favor. And I lived in New York for close to 15 years, and then I had a kid and my partner and I decided, well, partly we decided, partly we couldn't afford a 2-bedroom, that we wanted to be closer to family, and we moved back to Washington State, which is where I started to do the work I do now at Disability Rights Washington, and I started to meet a lot of other folks who couldn't drive, and that's how I started to think about non-drivers. So I'm going to pause my part of the presentation, and now you get to talk a little bit. So this next slide is an interactive slide. The picture, I went through my presentation and I tried to put as many Canada pictures as I could. So this is a trip in Ottawa I did recently. So you'll maybe recognize some other Canada transit photos in here. I haven't had a chance to stick any Montreal ones in there yet. So the question is, who do you know who can't drive or doesn't have reliable access to a car? Or if you're someone who doesn't drive, what is your experience of not driving? And I'd like you to think, as you answer this question, about whether you are, or the people you know are voluntary or involuntary non-drivers. So you can answer that however you like, and whoever is as bold wants to raise your hand. Louise is going to call on you. I think Owen up here is, I saw that one. Thank you.
Owen. To give others a chance to think. I'm the extrovert in the room, but so we're a family of 5 and we don't have a car. I had a driver's license. I've moved around a bunch of places, and essentially was in a position where I couldn't get my driver's license without taking driver's classes in French, which I hadn't learned yet. And then I was just like, well, let's just do this without a car. My wife, though, she's kind of grown up in a bunch of countries. And I would say, like, she's thought about getting a driver's license, but we kind of talked about this, but it's a source of anxiety to her, that she feels like she doesn't want to harm anyone else, and that I think that stops her, I guess, from doing that. So there's no necessarily physical aspect or anything, but it is like I guess a psychological barrier for her.
Yeah, no, we were talking about this, and I do hear from many, many people who there's so much anxiety around driving because of a traumatic experience in the past, a crash, an experience as a child getting hit by a car, or just that stress of being responsible for something that has the potential to really hurt or kill someone. I think that's a barrier for a lot of folks, and you wouldn't necessarily describe yourself as disabled, but it can still be a barrier that makes driving not safe or comfortable for you. And folks online, feel free to answer or in the chat or in the Q&A, and Magali is gonna read some of those. Do we have one?
So we have Maria saying, currently on my way to get a Bixie bike, voluntary non-driver. But while I have the mic, I might share an experience. I've visited a low vision person for many years, and being in Montreal with the kind of winters we have, with the challenges of snow clearing on sidewalks, which can become very slippery when you're aged and low vision. She used to tell me, oh, Magali, please do not age in Montreal. It's terrible. It feels like you're trapped inside half of the year because you can't rely even on walking to get around. So
yes.
It's an added burden in a city like Montreal when snow clearing isn't effective enough.
We're going to talk about sidewalks for sure. Anyone else in the room? And I actually was in Michigan yesterday, and I made everyone in the room answer this question. We went around. It was a super long workshop, and I was like, we're going to hear from everyone. And it was pretty cool for people to really sort of dig deep and think about who in their lives, who in their social circles can't drive, can't afford to drive, chooses not to drive. Do we have another volunteer?
Yes, we do.
Great.
Hey there. My name's Julian. Growing up just north of Montreal in Laval, which you could basically call suburbia, at least for us here in the greater Montreal. As a kid, like your question brings me back to being a kid growing up in suburbia, where it's basically impossible to just live a fulfilling childhood without being connected to your parents, being connected to a car, being connected to someone who has a car when you start growing up. And we used to try to get away from that in terms of like cycling. That's where I got my initial la piqûre, or the rush of loving cycling, because it was the best way to get around as a kid and trying to have a bit of freedom in a car-dependent suburbia. But I really feel like it has an impact on children in a big way, and then obviously a similar impact for someone who just can't drive even further down the road. We don't currently own a car. We have permits in the family, but in terms of how freeing it is not to own a car, especially with Montreal and even other suburbias becoming slightly less car-centric over time, I really feel like, and I hope that we are able to turn our neighborhoods into something that kids can grow up in without having the need for constant parent attention.
Thank you. Yes, I'm really glad that you talked about kids, and I think I'm gonna switch to the next slide here and talk a little bit about the different kinds of non-drivers. And as you can see, I have a slide with kids because kids are a big percentage of non-drivers, and often we just discount them. We're like, oh well, they'll turn 16 or they'll become adults and they'll get a license and then they'll be real people and we'll count them. But we need to count them now. For those of you who are parents or caregivers, kids need to go places. And if we create communities and transportation systems that work for them to go independently, they can. And even if they can't go independently, not every child has a parent or caregiver that can drive them places. And so if they don't, and our society is set up in a way where the only way they get access to activities and connections, sports, right, is by having a driving parent, kids without driving parents miss out. So this picture on the bottom is my kid and a neighborhood kid with my e-bike. The neighborhood kid loves the e-bike, begs to be taken around on the e-bike. My kid is less enthusiastic, but that's because he has to, right? Other kinds of non-drivers, right? We talked about people with disabilities, and obviously people who are blind or low vision, it's not really safe for us to drive. Some people with mobility disabilities, neuromuscular disabilities, epilepsy, traumatic brain injuries, mental health, chronic health conditions. There's all kinds of disabilities that can make driving not safe or comfortable. And sometimes those are static, and sometimes they can fluctuate both over the course of your lifetime or the course of a day, or even a couple of weeks, right? So this picture on the top, that's the Vancouver boardwalk, and some folks there at a conference. We are doing a walk roll audit with some bike folks up there. And then we talk about older people, right, who are aging out of driving. This is a picture of my grandma. She lived in a rural part of Indiana in the Midwest, and she had a heart condition that made her pass out unexpectedly. And so she kept driving because she lived in such a rural place that she didn't have access to groceries or anywhere if she didn't drive. But she would periodically pass out and drive off the road into the ditch. And someone would find her, and luckily it was all cornfields, and so she never hit anything. But not a great situation where that was her option to not have to move into a nursing home, not to have to give up sort of her community and that she loved and lived in. And for many adults, that's a hard choice, right? When you've built your life in a place, and driving is that the way to get around. And then we have this picture on my left, you're right. There are many people who can't afford to drive, and these are some folks in Ottawa waiting for the bus. But, when you look at who rides transit, and in particular, who rides buses, and I'm not sure if this is as true in Canada as in the US, but transit riders, tend to be lower income, tend to come from Black and brown communities, recent immigrants. Black households in the US are 3 times less likely to have access to a car than white households, and households of new immigrants are 7 times more likely to walk or roll or take transit. So big disparities in who has access to a car and who can afford that, or who has the documentation to legally drive. And then, there are people who choose not to drive. And I bet I know there are many people in this room tonight who are choice non-drivers. And you are also part of this non-driver coalition, this cohort that we can, as many of us out there, start to push for changes. This picture on the upper right is some folks in Detroit on a bike ride. And many of them were young women. And it's really exciting to me that there's sort of a generation of younger folks who are choosing not to get licenses as much as my generation did. When I was 16 in the 1990s, around 50% of people in the U.S., of 16-year-olds in the U.S., got driver's licenses. Now it's only 25%. It's a big decrease. And I think a lot of that has to do with the cost of driving going up quite a bit. But there's also, I think a lot of people have the anxiety around what it means to have that kind of stress and responsibility. And also, the climate awareness and the idea that we can choose to arrange our lives differently so that driving isn't as critical. So altogether, non-drivers, all of us, are about 1/3 of the population. And there's a couple statistics here. Let me see. I actually have Quebec and Ottawa statistics, which I'm so happy to have that you all pulled. In Quebec, 35% of the population doesn't have a driver's license, and 12% of households do not have a car. In Ottawa, 27% of the population does not have a driver's license. And in Washington State, it's around 30% of the population. So, these are, I don't have a national US number. I don't have a national Canada number. I would love to see that research with the way our US Census worked in the past, and who knows if we're even doing a census anymore, but in the past, we ask about cars per household, but not about who within that household, right, has access to those cars. So we don't really know, that piece of it. And this image is, again, I think I disconnected from the internet. Maybe I'll have you come. Anyway, there was an image of the screen of some people riding the bus in Ottawa, or it was pretty cold. I was there a couple of weeks, or it wasn't a month ago, and it was right after the canal melted, so I didn't get to go ice skating, which was my goal, but it was still really cold. I'm going to do another audience question, and then we'll go to the quote. But for those of us who grew up in areas that are supercar dependent, who couldn't drive, and we heard this from research in Washington State. I hear this as I go around the U.S. and Canada. Really, for non-drivers who live outside of big cities, or even some people in larger cities, how we get around most often is by asking friends and family for rides, because our communities are built so much around the car being the easiest and the safest and the quickest way to get places. And so I want you to think for a second, and this is an interactive piece we can put in the chat if we got the chat folks able to respond. Is there a time that you've had to rely on someone for a ride to go somewhere? And what did that feel like? What did you feel like you had to sort of negotiate or trade or offer in exchange for asking for a ride? Does anyone have an experience like that? want to share? Nobody? Yes.
Oh, sorry. On va commencer avec toi, Anne.
I've been, I didn't speak English for a long time, so sorry. As a teenager, I grew up in the suburbs, but like more the suburbs than Julien. Like it was in Laval. It's pretty close. I was like in a suburb where there were no buses on Sundays, so I couldn't get outside of town, my little town on Sundays. Mm-hmm. I never wanted a car, but I was dependent on my parents for everything. In my little town, I would ride my bicycle, but for the rest of my life, if I needed to go to school, I would take the bus. But if I was, as a teenager, I was still living there I left at 19, I would go out on Saturday nights if I didn't take the last bus at 1. So that meant leaving Montreal at midnight, so leaving the bar when the party started, and I had to go to Longueuil to take the bus, and then I would have to come home on Monday mornings because my parents, they were not the kind that would come and pick me up on Sundays. So for a long time I didn't go out, and then I just decided to live my life and left the suburbs because I could. It was a long time ago. Rents were cheaper in Montreal, so it was easier. But I didn't like it. I was not the kind of kid who would ask my parents, so I would just stay home and did nothing and didn't see. And my school was not in my city. My friends were in other suburb cities. I never saw them on weekends because I would not ask my parents for Lyft because I knew they would say no. So It was actually really sucked. But I was not I didn't have anything that physically made me not being able to. I had my driver's license, but I didn't want to use a car. It was, to me, I didn't have a car, and I didn't want to ask my parents for their car neither. So
yeah,
it sucked.
Yeah, no, and I think what you're describing there, right, is what I hear from both people who, have to temporarily ask for a ride to get somewhere, and they feel like that guilt, and they don't feel like they can ask. But also, from non-drivers who don't have that option. And maybe you could ask, your parents to drive you to a doctor's appointment when it's super critical. But asking to go out with friends, that feels like much more discretionary, and so those sort of social activities are what people give up. Are we good again?
We're working on the connection.
Okay, working on the connection.
got
But we have
someone in the
another
front.
person up here.
Yep.
Yeah, great.
Not sure if this is what you're thinking about, but a few decades ago, I hitchhiked across Canada. Mm-hmm. So there you need a ride, and you're not really offering much except for company on the ride. So
Yeah.
it's a very vulnerable position to be in, depending on where you happen to find yourself along the Trans-Canada Highway. Some of them are less propitious for getting a ride.
Yeah. Have you hitchhiked more recently?
Never.
No. Yeah.
I wouldn't.
Yeah.
Not today.
Yeah. I have hitchhiked as well, and trying to get places in the U.S. when I wanted to go out hiking in the mountains. Not probably the safest choice, but there was no transit, and I was young, and I felt invincible, and definitely did that a little bit.
I'd like to add that I haven't owned a car for about 8 years, and it's so liberating. Mm-hmm. And when I do need a car, there's a car share company in town, so it's pretty easy to get a car when I need one. But most of the time, I'm using public transit or walking or cycling in the summer.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
sharing. Yeah. So I want to sort of go to our next piece with transit, because we're gonna keep on going here. So if you can't ask for a ride, if you don't feel like that's an option for you, what I'm hearing in these stories, and what I've heard from other people around the country, and both here and in the U.S., is that riding transit provides that sort of freedom, because you're not relying on favors from strangers, right? You're not relying on parents or loved ones for that sort of access to where you need to go. And biking also, right? And I know we're in the bike group here, so we're going to get to biking, don't worry. But there's lots of times in which biking is not an option also, and so that transit can provide that fill in those gaps. And so thinking about, in your own experience, where transit goes, and maybe, you know, for you all now here in Montreal, you have a really great transit system compared to many places in the country, where transit goes and where it doesn't go, and if you lived in a more suburban area, maybe growing up, what you had access to, what you didn't have access to. Does anyone have any stories about transit access? Yes.
Hi. So recently I was trying to get to l'Île Perrot, which is like, I don't know, northwest of Montreal, like suburbs, but it's kind of close, but like the transit is bad. I drive, but I don't like driving in the city, and I bike, but it was a little far, like 30 kilometers or something. And so I could get there by public transit. I was hosting a conference in a public library at night. So I could get there. I think it took me 2 hours and a half on public transit, but I couldn't come back. So I decided I would take an Uber to the closest subway station. But it was kind of a bit late at night, and the driver made me feel a bit uncomfortable. Like he offered to drive me home instead of dropping me at the station. And when you talk about safety in transit, I was so grateful when I got in the subway station because I felt safe, like all around people. And I really don't like using taxis or Uber alone at night. Like most of drivers are men, and it wasn't the first time I got like comments like that. So so I was able to make it, but I wish there were a bus at night as well, because it's not that far from Montreal.
Yeah. No, thank you. And thank you for bringing up the rideshare piece, the like taxi or ride, you know, Uber or Lyft, because I think I've had that experience too. I think, you know, many women in this room probably have, where there's just that little bit of like, oh my gosh, what is happening here? You know, when they start going not on the route they're supposed to, or, you know, you always have that question in the back of your head. I had the chance when I was in Arizona to take one of the Waymo, autonomous vehicles. And I am not a proponent of autonomous vehicles solving our transportation crisis. I think they're just going to make our cities more car dependent. But it was so interesting to get into that vehicle and not have a driver that I had to worry about, like, being weird. It was this, like, sense of relief. And I hadn't really realized how much stress it is when you are, you know, with a taxi driver, that sort of negotiation of, like, am I going to be okay? What do I need to say? What do I need to not say in this situation? So thank you for bringing that up. I have another. Yes.
Yeah. So living in the city, one of the things that we want to do when we live in a city is to go outside and enjoy the outdoors. Mm-hmm. And that's typically a place where it's really lacking in terms of transit to get there. So I just remember one time we didn't have driver's license, and I was with my brother. We wanted to go to a climbing training. So it was off the main transportation network. So our solution was to get the bus as far as we could, and then it took us the overnight to get there. So we had to camp on our way to our training. It was winter, so we had to ski and camp and ski and get to our training the next day.
That's
so that was the
intense.
solution. And it was honestly the only solution, apart from hitchhiking, that we had.
Yeah. Wow. I hope it was worth it. Good stories, huh? All right. I think we're back. We're back connected, and we're back connected here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read this quote since we've already sort of covered this one, and then I'll ask you guys to participate on the next one. But this is Jaime Torres, who's a non-driver from Washington State, who's had a traumatic brain injury, and he, you know, this talking about, you know, that sort of what that burden of asking friends and family, going to that piece. He says, "It is beyond frustrating having to depend on others for transportation. It really affects me to the point where it's easier just to isolate myself in my room so I don't feel like a burden." And that feeling like a burden, I think, is something that many non-drivers experience. So I asked you to share this already, and I'll just describe. This is me asking my dad for rides in Washington State, and he is turning 80. He is 80. He's turning 81 this year, and is not necessarily the safest driver. I think on this particular trip, we drove for 45 minutes, and he had his turn signal on, and I was sort of waiting for him to notice, and he didn't notice. Luckily, we were in a super rural area, so I didn't feel too unsafe. But you know, even loved ones, right? Even friends and family, it can feel like a burden. You know, my partner can drive. We have a vehicle, and I don't very often feel like I can ask for favors, even, you know, to have him go to Costco to like do a big shop. It feels always like a negotiation. So we talked about transit is freedom, and I'll read this quote as well, and then we'll move on. So this is Abby Griffith. She grew up in a semi-rural area of Washington State, similar to I, and had a mom who was a single mom, didn't have the ability to drive her everywhere she wanted to go, and so as a teenager, she felt really isolated and depressed. And then she was able to move to a city and move next to a bus stop, and she was able to take the bus to the grocery store whenever she wanted to go meet friends. And she says, the room I rented was right next to the bus number 30. It was life-changing for me to know that I had access to places. And I think, that kind of freedom, maybe people experience when they move to a city, when they get a driver's license, when they have access to a bike, when they're allowed to go. I think it's important for us to have that sort of ability to go where we need to go, when we want to go, without having it be a constant negotiation. So I asked you to share some stories here, but yeah, where transit goes in your community, where does it not go? What are times that it doesn't go? And that's another Canada picture stuck in there. Is anyone online? Do we get some people back online want to share any experiences from about transit, where it goes, where it doesn't go? Or anyone else here in this room? No, Not for now. Okay. Sure. Yeah.
I guess, yeah, so that often comes up, the aspect of where transit goes, and it is kind of related to how we develop it, because so I've always kind of had low car use, and then I moved to Japan, and I was like, oh, you can do everything, because you get the access to nature with transit, because they realize like that's a place people want to go. So it's like oh, in the North American context, like we have to make very clear decisions on what neighborhood we'll live in. So we'll often have to live in a very central neighborhood just to give us those options, because for kids, like all the activities and things like this, when the weekend, we lived in Quebec City before, and the public transport just crashes on the weekend. Yeah. So your ability to take your kids to these activities becomes very limited. And anytime my parents live in a rural area and we visit them, we're completely dependent on them. And it gets to the point that my wife doesn't want to go visit them because it's so stressful for her always having to say, it's like, oh, we need to go to the grocery store because I need to get stuff for the kids that you don't know what to get. Yeah, and so it's like a burden on her that then limits her
even
desire.
As family.
Yeah, even as family. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Let's keep going. So when we're talking about transit access, and I think this is something, if you have never experienced having a disability or perhaps have never pushed a stroller, around, you think about this less because it's probably easier to sort of just, figure out a way around if sidewalks are blocked or if they don't exist and you kind of have to, walk along a shoulder. It feels less scary than, say, you have a wheelchair or you're using a stroller or a grocery cart. But without that sort of connected pedestrian network, our transit access is also limited, right? Because if you can't get to that bus stop, you don't have access. So I'm gonna have someone read here Crystal's quote. You can either read it in English or French. And if you could share in your own experience after you read the quote, thinking about, transit access in your community, how is that access? Would it be accessible to someone with a wheelchair? What are the sidewalks like? Is there an elevator? What are the conditions of the sidewalks in different times of the year? So I need one volunteer to read this quote and share an experience. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to describe these images on the screen. The image on the left is Crystal, who you're going to hear from in a second. She's trying to get a sidewalk built connecting the bus stop to her apartment complex. And on the right, this is a more rural area, but I'm sure this exists here in this province, right? Where it's a bus stop, but it's loose gravel. And so Kat, who is waiting in that power wheelchair, she has to wait in the road. It's a high-speed rural road because she can't pull into the gravel or she'll get stuck or she'll tip over her chair. So, do we have a volunteer?
Awesome. I'm going to read in French because
okay.
C'est écrit en français. Nous devons commencer à considérer les transports en commun et les trottoirs comme allant de pair plutôt que comme deux choses distinctes. On ne peut pas utiliser le bus si on ne peut pas se rendre à l'arrêt. And that's clearly true. And like, I'm I'm not unabled. I can walk, and I've been cycling since I moved to Montreal more than 30 years ago, and I've been cycling around Montreal. That's the best way for me to get everywhere whenever I want. But I had a kid 13 years ago, and for 1 year, I couldn't ride my bicycle because it was too young. And I didn't have a car. I didn't want to use a car. I'm not a car user. And I had to take the bus with a stroller. And then for anyone who does not understand what it's like for someone in a wheelchair, just borrow your friend's kid one day and try to take the bus and the metro in Montreal with a stroller. It got better. We have new buses. They at stops now, they can lower. But still, the metro in Montreal, you think we have a great public transport system, but it's not good. There's no elevators. Most of the time, like my metro station, the nearest to my house, if I take the entrance that's closest, it's only staircases. So I can't go down with a stroller and my kid and all this stuff. And in the other one, there are escalators, but not from the street to the first level, it's stairs. Yeah. So our system is not really nice. And to go back to what you were saying about safety, it's very recent that in Montreal, we can ask to get off the bus between stops. It used to be just for women after 7 when it was dark, which was weird because you can feel unsafe even if you're not a woman. But now we can ask whenever, but that's another way to, it doesn't have anything to do with sidewalks, but it's also a way of making it more accessible to everyone, because if you don't feel safe because you're going to have to get out at a stop where it's not fun in your neighborhood, this stop, especially if you're in a wheelchair. So now I hope it's everywhere in the world where you can just ask to the driver to get off whenever. But
that's really cool. No, and I think it probably does help access too, right? Because if the normal stop is not accessible, then maybe there's a slope or something that you can't navigate to be able to get off somewhere else. That's cool. Thanks for volunteering.
Anna, if you'll allow me, I'll maybe pitch in with something.
Yeah.
It's Magali here.
Yeah.
From our online viewers, Eric says, we need to be thinking of people who live outside of urban centers, just as your mother, you were citing how living in a rural environment can be very limiting. And he says in Quebec, for example, in Lanaudière, which is a region around here, there is close to no transit at all along the 131. And he says it's just one example out of many, and the population is clearly aging. More and more people are losing their licenses. And he says, if we don't adjust things, are we not risking within a few years to have a major mobility crisis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly, right? Because, as people are aging out, it is such a thing. Thank you for sharing that. All right, I'm going to have someone read this quote too. And if I want to share one more sidewalk story, this is a quote from Tanisha Sepulveda, who's pictured here in a power wheelchair rolling in the street because the sidewalk is inaccessible. And then there's some barriers and some other photos. We have a lot of, I know you don't have them here, but in the States, in a lot of our cities, we have the scooter share rentals that are free floating, so they're not docked. So they can be parked and left anywhere, and it's a real access barrier. Snow and some uplifts and sidewalks. That one is right outside my kids' school. It's almost like a step. Does anyone want to read Tanisha's quote, English or French?
I'm going to do it.
Yes.
So let's go. It is even less safe for me to be on the sidewalk when the curb cuts are not in place, or they are dips in the cement, or roots that have lifted up the sidewalk or gravel. And actually, in Montreal, we have a lot of road work, and that's often too a huge issue. Not even if sometimes the work is not even on the sidewalk, but there are signs, and the work crews doesn't necessarily think about that. Maybe the engineer made a great plan, but the work crews just place the signal post on the sidewalk, even if it's to say that the road is blocked. Now you just blocking for everyone.
Yeah.
And that's a huge frustration, and that's something that I have a great pastime. I always move those things around. I did it yesterday, so it's a great workout. Do it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And it's funny because I actually was doing this presentation yesterday in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and heard from a wheelchair user who shared the exact same frustration with those signs that are placed in the sidewalk for road construction. And she has to, try to knock them out of the way with her wheelchair because otherwise, there's not really an option for her to get around. So thank you for moving those. All right. And then the last piece of sort of, that sidewalk connection, that pedestrian network piece I want to talk on. And I'm sure, as people who bike, this is something we think about a lot. It's those crossings. At least in the US, statistics show that it's the crossings that are most dangerous. It's where most cyclists get hit, most cyclists get injured or killed. And, for pedestrians too, it can be super dangerous. Especially, if we have bus stops that are on these busier streets, right? How are you crossing? Or if we have, just places like this in this picture, this is Sarah who is trying to get to the Walmart in their community and there's no sidewalk and they're on this road which is right next to a major highway and so cars are, traveling at highway speeds. And so we talked already. I've heard a lot of stories from you all, so I'm not going to ask you to share more unless there's another online story around, missing sidewalks, missing crossings that are particularly unfortunate, scary, unsafe. Anyone else want to share online? Yes.
So online, Eric again says, in villages such as Saint-Émilie-de-l'Énergie in the north of Lanaudière, there is no sidewalk. In summer, walking is difficult. In winter, it is clearly impossible. There are 2 bus stops with service twice a day, great service level here. But in winter, they are in effect completely inaccessible. And we have also Yvonne online who shares, I have a guide dog and can relate to signage placed on sidewalks. I end up having to find a different route to get to where I want to go.
Yeah. Thank you. And just remember, to go back for a second, we're talking about, 35% of the population in Quebec, right? Is 45% in Montreal? Was that the stat? Yeah. I mean, are non-drivers. And so it's not like we're just like, oh, it's just a few people we're just inconveniencing, right? There's a lot of people who are not having the access we need. And, the other piece I want to touch on here, right, is, so we're talking right now a lot about this transportation, how we solve that transportation piece. How do you get from A to B safely? But we can also think about, the land use side of the equation. How do we reduce the distances that we need to travel so that they aren't such barriers, right? So that they are closer, so that you don't have to have a bus, you can walk or roll, so that people aren't priced out of, closer in urban areas into suburban areas where they would prefer not to live, but can't afford to live closer in. There's a quote here from Von Braun. I'll read this one. He says, more affordability means moving further out. Moving further out means more limited transportation. And, much of the U.S., much of, major cities that are growing, right, this sort of pressure to, the affordable bits are on the outskirts. And then those outskirts don't have transit, don't have sidewalks. And so that's another piece that we need to look at, right? We can't just be building housing out there. That's the cheaper housing. So thinking about in your own community, and in this, whether you live in a city, maybe you live in an area that has less services, or you live in a rural area, where are the places you need to go and how far are they from where you need to go? And I know this room here in Montreal, there's probably, I was like so happy this morning when I woke up and could walk out of my hotel and there was a coffee shop 3 blocks away. That's not the situation where I live in Seattle. We're a much more suburban city. And I imagine for, some more of the folks in Montreal, in Quebec, that's probably a challenge as well. This picture on the screen is of Cody Shane, who lives in a small town in Washington State. And I actually include this picture because this town where he lives in, unlike many small towns, actually still has a grocery store. And that's why he can live there, because he's a non-driver. He has intellectual disabilities, but he uses a trike to get around town, and he can go to the Safeway and he can get groceries because that Safeway has chosen, for whatever reason, to still be there and not close, while so many of our smaller towns and rural communities have lost services. So I'm wondering, if anyone has a story they want to share about, a service or a grocery store, school, job, something that was close or versus something that was, not accessible, that was too far away to be accessed.
I can maybe pitch in.
Yes.
There's in the West Island. There's a small village called Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue, and their grocery store recently closed about 1 or 2 years ago, and they're struggling to get it up and running again. And it means people with no cars basically rely on what we call dépanneur to, so it's becoming a food desert.
Yep.
And they can't access food. And the other one that I find pretty ironic is I remember arriving in Montreal and needing to get a new driver's license because I have a European one, and having to figure out how to get to the SIQ, which is the Automobile Insurance Board, the office where you need to go to be allowed to drive is so inaccessible. It's on Henri Bourassa on a bus stop in the middle of nowhere. And I was like, how did they not think about that? It's so, well, of course, it's the SIQ. It's pretty car-centric, right? But to not realize that if you need to get their services, chances are you don't have the driver's license that they're supposed to provide you with. And so it'd be great if you could actually access it in another way than a car. Struck me at the time, and that was about 20 years ago, but it hasn't changed.
That's really funny. That's a great story. All right. I promised you bikes, and we're getting there. This story is this particular slide is about e-bikes and e-bike access. And because we were just talking about some of these further distances, right? Because so many of our communities, not here in a city proper, but further out, right, are so car dependent. The distances we need to travel are large. Or if you have, a kid to carry, hills like we have in Seattle, big hills, e-bikes can really close those gaps, can sort of, I call it like kind of mending the car-dependent land use that we have by closing some of those distances, making them more feasible. Or perhaps you have a disability where, biking with an e-assist is going to make it possible for you to get where you need to go. So this picture is some folks in my neighborhood in Seattle who, many of us are disabled, many of us actually, I think like 4 of us in that picture can't drive, can't get a license, but we use e-bikes to get around and get our kids around. And it was actually really cool to be able to find other people in Seattle who had the same situation I did, and I felt like, oh my gosh, there's actually a lot of us who are e-biking who can't drive, but it's a great option for us. So the question, and I'm going to go to the next slide as you think about this, but has having an e-bike changed your access? Does anyone here e-bike? Know folks who e-bike? Yeah, cargo bike, e-cargo bike. Does that e-boost add to where it's possible for you to get, or where someone is possible for them to get? So thinking about that, hold that in your head. And think about power chairs as well. And actually I saw, as I was walking around today, quite a few mobility scooters parked on people's front porches, which made me think that maybe people are able to take advantage of some of the bike infrastructure you have here. This is a picture of Ian Mackey, who's a power chair user from Washington State, who's been a huge proponent of making sure that we have better power chairs that take some of these incredible batteries that we've gotten now with e-bikes and e-trikes and are incorporated into power chairs so that they're longer lasting. And he's also pushing power chair manufacturers to make power chairs that can deal with more weather conditions, can deal with rain, can deal with cold, can deal with heat. And he says, because right now many power chairs can't do this, he says oftentimes people's lifestyles are shaped by the equipment that they have. A family should be able to go spend the day at Disneyland and not run out of batteries. So as all of us are fighting, right, for better bikes, better bike infrastructure, I think it's important for us to think inclusively about e-mobility, right? So it's not just bikes, it's also power chairs, it's also mobility scooters, it's also trikes, it's also family bikes, because all of these together can expand mobility access when the distances we need to travel are far. While we're doing that, though, we need to make sure that we're not creating licensing or insurance requirements that are going to exclude people like myself, people like Ivy here, people like Devin and Rachel who were in that other photo, who can't get driver's licenses because of our vision, because of other disabilities. We need to make sure that we're not creating sort of licensing and regulations of this new e-bike space. And unfortunately in the US, and I know less about what's happening in Canada here, but in the US, there's a lot of states that are proposing e-bike regulation and e-bike insurance requirements. And Ivy here is from Tucson, Arizona. She is older than I am. Her kids are college age now, but as she was raising them, she rode them around in a golf cart because she is also low vision, can't get a driver's license, and lives in this very sprawling suburban area in Arizona where, there wasn't transit, no transit at all. But she was able to sort of, go through the edges of parking lots and use bike paths to get them where they needed to go using a golf cart. And she says, for someone like me who doesn't have a choice to drive a car, licenses and insurance requirements for e-bikes seem to be unnecessarily restrictive on people who already have limited choices. This is my only vehicle to get myself around. So when e-bikes came along, she quickly ditched the golf cart because the batteries didn't last very long, got an e-bike, and now she uses an e-bike. But she tried to insure her golf cart when she had a golf cart, and get it registered properly. And because she didn't have a license, she wasn't able to do that. And she fears that the same sort of requirements for e-bikes that some states are proposing would exclude her. So I'm going to take an audience bit real quick. Yes.
Yes, we have someone in the front.
Yes. Wants to share an e-bike story?
No, I'd like to know what you have against regulation, licensing, and insurance requirements, because I think those are good ideas.
Well, if insurance was required for e-bikes right now, a lot of insurance companies require a driver's license, right, to be able to get that insurance. And because I can't get a driver's license, Ivy can't get a driver's license, we wouldn't be able to have an e-bike, right? But we can safely bike. And I would love to share, I wrote an article for Bike Minnesota about this. There are so many people who can safely e-bike who can't safely drive because the car speed and the car mass, like your ability to actually, injuries to happen, right, and to be serious injuries are much higher. Where if I'm going under 15 miles an hour on a bike, I'm much less likely to cause serious harm, and I'm also able to see much more clearly. So thanks for that question. I think it's an important one and it's an important discussion. Yeah.
We have someone else in the back.
Okay, one person in the back, and then I do want to leave some time for you all to ask general questions, and so let's do this, and then we'll start wrapping things up. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what you were saying about how e-bikes are a very accessible form of mobility and transportation for people with disabilities. My father, who's 80, has severe arthritis in his back, has had multiple surgeries, and can barely walk 100 meters without severe pain, but he can ride his e-bike for hours. And it's a great form of exercise. It hasn't really replaced his utilitarian travel, but it's an opportunity for him to be physically active in ways that he can't otherwise be. So I think that we tend to demonize e-bikes in unfortunate ways. And I think we also tend to, or maybe us in the room don't necessarily do this, but I think generally speaking, there's an assumption that cycling is a very ableist form of activity, and in fact, I think it can be a very inclusive form of physical activity, especially if we embrace e-bikes.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, part of that is, right, often, for people with disabilities, it maybe is seen as a form of like recreation, right? Or it can be used recreationally because there's so much support that's needed and you need to make sure you have the infrastructure to do it safely and, where are you gonna leave this bike or trike at the end of the trip? And so a lot of it is on all of us as people who love biking and wanna see better bike infrastructure for parking, for storage, wide enough bike lanes for wider trikes and bikes to push for those things so that biking and e-biking and e-triking can become more realistic everyday transportation options for people with disabilities who would like to be able to do that. But right now, without the ability to use the infrastructure or to store your device without it getting stolen, it's just not feasible. And so we lose people from this sort of ability, this coalition of non-drivers, right, who want to be able to do things. So I want to end with another idea for you all to take away. And I left some stickers at the back of the room. Feel free to grab as many as you want. But this is something we started in Washington State in 2021. And it's called the Week Without Driving. And the idea is to help our elected leaders and people who are decision makers in our communities understand what it's like to be an involuntary non-driver. And so we ask them for 1 week to try to not drive and to get around walking, rolling, taking transit, biking, asking for rides if they want to pay for rides. That's all on the table. And they can even drive if they need to. But just to reflect on that, like what trips were really hard? What trips did they decide to grab the keys and drive because it was just too unsafe or too complicated or not feasible? And, you know, this is now, we started in 2021. It's now spread across the US and Canada. We had participation from more than 500 organizations last year in all 50 states, a couple of provinces. This picture on the left is a bus wrap for Week Without Driving that the transit agency in Toledo, Ohio made for the week as a way to sort of celebrate what an essential service they provide for community members. So this coming year, it is September 29th. Oh my gosh, is that last year? I think that is last year's logo. I'm just realizing. It's September 29th through October 5th this year. And I encourage you to check it out, weekwithoutdriving.org. It's a way to sort of engage with people who maybe are your allies already in government or at agencies, but don't fully understand what it's like to really try to rely on transit, to really try to improve things. And with that, I'm going to open it up for some more sort of general questions. There's my contact info again. And I do, you know, one question I have if anyone does want to share is, you know, if you are someone who does normally drive in the course of your week, what would it mean to do Week Without Driving for you? What would the trips be that would be trickier to make, and why? What would that experience be like for you? So that's my challenge question for you, if anyone wants to respond to that, but I'm also happy to take some general questions. Thank you. Yeah.
So online we have some pretty precise / technical questions. There's been some talks about curb cuts. And why are we, I guess if I'm trying to sum up what's being said online, is why are we kind of ruining our sidewalks just to allow vehicles to go through them, to enter parking lots and such? There's been talk about continuous sidewalks. So is that maybe the kind of solution that, or at least, you know, help that we should be trying to get to make walking and rolling more comfortable?
Yeah, I mean, I know, you know, vehicles turning in and out of, you know, parking lots is a big safety concern, especially for folks who are blind or low vision. I'm not sure what you mean by continuous sidewalks. Is that like raised crosswalks?
So basically the sidewalks.
Oh, like a raised crosswalk is what we would call that in the, yeah. Yeah.
So maybe I'll just share that for the people who are online. Owen was sharing with us what we mean with a raised sidewalk or the raised intersection is that it's not the sidewalk that goes down in the intersection for at the level of the cars. Instead, it's the cars that need to go up when they're crossing. We have a few of those in Montreal.
It's also regulated across all sidewalks. So your sidewalk length should, so Sweden does it, like it's just. So the continuous sidewalk idea is that there is no sidewalk that would ever be sloped because of the difficulties that, especially for elderly in the winter, that causes slip hazards. So the sidewalk, even not just intersections, but just continuous. So yeah. So that is like what I see the standard in, as I'd say in Sweden, is that is, and then Japan does it by just saying, why do you have a sidewalk? Have bollards, that, right? And then you just have the same. And then you have to have the low vision things to help.
That was the first thing that came to my mind, and this is getting a little wonky probably, but you know, for folks who are blind or low vision, you know, those tactile domes are standard in a lot of places, and so knowing when you're crossing a street. But you know, part of that is in the U.S. we just have these high-speed corridors, and pedestrians are always expected to yield, and if that paradigm shifted, then you know it could shift. Thanks. Any questions or comments here?
I have a question here.
Yes.
There you go, Stefan.
Merci, Louis. Thank you for your presentation. It was really entertaining and I learned a lot. We have a lot of criteria to think about when we're designing sidewalks for blind people or people with low vision. Is there any criteria or key considerations to take into account while designing bike paths for people with low vision?
Yeah, I love that question, and I love it. I mean, so in the U.S. we have the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and it only covers pedestrian infrastructure for people with disabilities. Doesn't even touch guidance for bike infrastructure, which I think is a real. I mean, in some ways the ADA is outdated and not so useful, but that we're not even thinking about disabled people biking and what disabled people need to bike is unfortunate. I've seen, obviously, if you're using a wider bike lanes, so you have room to pass. My colleague Cecilia uses a manual wheelchair, and then she uses an e-boost on her wheelchair for mountain biking. She has a mountain biking wheelchair, and it's really long. And so for her, a major barrier on a lot of bike infrastructure is any of the sort of turn situations that try to prevent vehicles from being on bike paths. She can't get through those. And so really thinking about how can we make sure that wider, longer e-bikes have that access. I've seen in the Netherlands, right, that there's some bike infrastructure that's been designed for seniors, where the bike lanes are wider and the curbs are high contrast. And as someone who's low vision, I love that idea because I definitely hit curbs sometimes. And so having a high contrast curb or a high contrast edge sounds really nice. My other pet peeve is, on signage. Car signage is, a certain size, and then bike signage is always smaller. And I can never read the bike signage. Oftentimes I can't read the car signage either, but it's even harder to read the bike, signage because the fonts are even smaller. And so that's I love any kind of signage that's actually on the ground because that's easier for me to see. And if I need to get closer to it, I can get closer to it versus something that's up higher. So those are my but I don't, some sort of standard bike guidance I think would be really awesome. Yeah.
I have someone else right here.
Yes.
On that point, you could address that problem using Bluetooth, they're called iBeacons. So your phone could be giving you verbal interpretations of the signage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've tried some of those things, and sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't, right?
Well,
and then it's that unreliability sometimes of technology.
They're not widely distributed.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, we have a yes.
So this is a personal question of mine. One thing that Vélo Québec has been pushing for or asking is for better compensation of pedestrians and cyclists who may be victims of road crashes or slips and falls. Because right now our compensation system is a public one, and the criteria to be compensated and have access to medical care, for example, after being injured, is that a motor vehicle must be involved. And in my mind, well, first of all, we're lacking the data to establish how many people slip and fall.
Yeah.
And I have this intuition that how car-centric our whole design and infrastructure does cause crashes that don't involve motor vehicles per se, but because the infrastructure is thought out for motor vehicles, it does end up creating situations where cyclists and pedestrians have to, share sidewalks, for example, or where sidewalks are slippery, or where the curb the slope is not adapted. So, do we have enough data to kind of quantify what the impact of a car-centric infrastructure and environment has on vulnerable road users?
Oh my gosh, that's such an interesting question. And I immediately, my head went to potholes too, because all the heavy cars, right, are what causes potholes. And as a cyclist, right, you hit a pothole and you hit it wrong and it's big enough and you're in trouble. It's such a good question. And you could even go beyond just sort of that direct physical injury to all the public health consequences too, right? Of air pollution, of lack of physical activity, right? Of social isolation, right? It just gets bigger and bigger. But the slips and falls and accidents piece, I don't have the data, but I think that's a great research project for someone. Yeah.
I have again, someone in the front.
I'd just like to respond to the latest intervention. The reason why it has to be a motor vehicle involved is because it's funded by insurance premiums paid by, yes. So for what you want, cyclists would have to start paying insurance premiums to make it fair.
We'll have an interesting discussion around beer around that.
No, but do you understand my point?
I understand that's the way it was designed, but I don't want to steal the show from this conversation. But we can discuss that. We have a question online, which is how safe are bidirectional bike lanes for low vision people? What are your thoughts on bidirectional bike lanes?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a good one. We have just comparatively few bike lanes in Seattle. I don't love them, honestly, but I hear that you're moving away from them and moving towards single direction ones so they can be a little wider. And I think just the width is really nice to have that ability. It's a bit more forgiveness, right? And then if you have a wider, bike, you have a bit more ability to pass people or all of that. So, but I haven't, I think, generally the speed as a low vision cyclist that I travel at, I only travel at the speed I'm safe going at. And when I talk to a lot of other low vision cyclists for this article I wrote, that was the common theme is you are very vulnerable as a cyclist. We've all probably crashed. It hurts. You don't want to crash. And so you are very intentionally going at the speed at which you can see where you're going. And so, I go slower, but people probably would like to be able to pass me sometimes in a wider bike lane. So, yeah.
Hi, and wondering about recommendations on regulations, because you talked about ones that you're worried about coming in. Mm-hmm. Are there ones that you feel that could be removed or changed that would have a big impact on facilitating better travel options for people?
In the e-bike space particularly, or more broadly?
As you wish.
The one right away that comes to mind is that a lot of states are moving right now to regulate throttle e-bikes because they're in a different class. And I personally, I have an e-bike, a cargo e-bike that is not a throttle e-bike, and I'm okay accelerating through intersections how I need to. But I also used to race bikes, so I have a lot of strength. Not everyone has that, and I won't always, right? And so I do think that I don't feel like the throttle should be, especially if you're on a heavier bike that you have a hard time getting up to speed and being stable on. That to me doesn't feel like where we should draw the line.
Yeah, somebody at a safety conference last week talked about that as the torque or the power, because that's actually going to limit you being able to get up hills or carry somebody. Because cargo bikes, you can carry an adult in there, but you couldn't get up a hill if you have regulations on that.
And I do think rather, if we are going to regulate, it should be around speed, right? And just limiting speed. And in Europe, right, e-bike speeds are limited. It's less. And off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember what it was. But my friend Devin, who was pictured there with the Urban Arrow, the cargo bike, the bucket cargo bike, he moved to France. He left Seattle, he got frustrated, and he brought his bike with him. And it's actually illegal, the speeds that it can go. And he doesn't, because he's low vision, he never goes that fast anyway. But he says it's fine to have a slower speed limit
I think
for
it's
e-bikes.
around 20, at least in Germany when I was there. 25 is there we go, Magalinos.
Yeah.
With the throttle in Europe, that stops at 6 kilometers an hour, so it allows for starting and getting through intersection and getting started, but doesn't allow to go to the full maximum speed. Mm-hmm. I believe we have a question in the back.
Great.
Yes, I was just wondering, sometimes we ask, for traffic calming measures or sidewalks or stuff like that in neighborhoods, and sometimes it's met with resistance. How do you think bringing in, non-drivers and people who cannot drive into the message, into the communication to leaders, how do you think it probably helps, but how do you feel it's received differently by leaders and people who can, enact these measures in cities and towns and?
Yeah. So I think the question you're asking is is it helpful to have a bigger coalition? Is that kind of? Yeah. And I think it is, and I think politics, at least in the US, there's this sense of like, oh, cyclists are entitled and privileged, which is not true. Many people bike out of necessity. But when we can have these tables that also include disabled people, that also include transit riders, that include children, that include seniors, right, that include people who can't afford to drive, it creates a larger political coalition, and I think that allows us to push for change. But I think it also requires us, right, to acknowledge that we all have needs, and that not all of those needs can necessarily right now be met through biking or e-biking even. And so, thinking about mobility access, moving away from car dependency in sort of a broader sense, and that there's all these pieces, and that maybe for some trips, some people want to bike, but for not all trips. And, I personally love to take the bus in the winter because I don't like cleaning my bike when it gets wet and muddy. Like, I just don't want to deal with, that. And I love being able to have a bus system that I can, when I'm not in the mood to deal with biking, use. And so, thinking about that piece as well.
I think we're running out of questions in the room, but still feel free to raise your hand. There are no other questions online. Maybe I'd finish with the last one, Anna. Why do you think it's always the car that is presented as the inclusive option? When we've seen that so many people can't drive, and some of them can bike. We've had great examples of 80-year-olds with severe back pains who can still bike but can't walk that much. And how do we change that conversation?
Yeah, that is the question, right? Is how do we change that conversation? I mean, because we have built our communities largely around cars, right? So cars are often, and not in every city, right? But in most places in North America, cars are the easiest and the safest and the most accessible way to get somewhere. But that's a choice, and that's a choice of prioritization, and it's a choice that doesn't work for so many people. 35% of the population of Quebec, right? It's not working for particularly well. And so I think, first of all, it's just making visible how many people aren't served by car dependency, right? That's the first step. And then the second step is, starting to push for solutions and trying to push for solutions that work for people who have the least options. Because I think if we, serve those of us who have more options, more money to, pay for, taxis when we need to, more access to be able to bike because we have that physical ability, we're leaving people behind. And I think it's important to really start at, okay, who has the least choices? Whose mobility is most limited in our current system? And how can we design solutions that work for them? And then work to expand that, right? And so that's sort of, from my perspective, how we can start to change that conversation and build a bigger, stronger coalition to do so. Yeah.
What a great way to end this talk. I think we can give you a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much for co-hosting and dealing with all the tech. Yeah.
No, thank you. It was really enlightening, and I really do hope it encourages all of us advocates to work together, get out of our silos, not consider ourselves, competing for the whatever little space is left for us, but really work together and show how many of us there are who do not drive and how we all deserve better transportation options. So that's really amazing. I'm going to switch to French for the rest, to give a little bit of information. Avant de passer au 5 à 7, je voudrais vous rappeler qu'on a deux événements qui s'en viennent. Oh, can you just change that one last slide for me, please? Yes, perfect. We're all good. Donc, les deux prochains rendez-vous, vous le savez, on le disait d'emblée de jeu, cette conférence s'inscrit dans le cadre du festival Go Vélo Montréal et on a deux grands événements qui s'en viennent cette fin de semaine. On a donc le Tour la nuit vendredi, donc demain soir, qui va nous ouvrir une vingtaine de kilomètres de rue pour rouler tous ensemble. Et puis, dimanche, le Tour de l'île de Montréal, le 1er juin, une cinquantaine de kilomètres qui va nous amener à explorer tout l'est de l'île, le nord et l'est de l'île. Et notre PDG aurait peut-être une question à poser. Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un ici qui n'a pas encore participé au Tour de l'île ou au Tour la nuit? On a deux mains qui se sont... Oh mon Dieu! Eh bien, le Père Noël vient de passer. Et voilà, Jean-François vous remet une paire de billets pour pouvoir y prendre part. 2 paires de billets. Voilà. Merci beaucoup pour ça. Donc, on va maintenant prendre quelques minutes pour réarranger la salle, sortir les bières qui sont offertes par notre partenaire, le Ciboire, et une belle variété de fromages aussi. C'est l'avantage d'avoir un partenaire qui est le lait, c'est d'avoir une belle variété de bons fromages. J'espère que vous avez faim et que vous avez soif. Je vous rappelle que les livres d'Anna sont également en vente à l'arrière, si vous voulez en profiter pour attraper une copie. Ils ne sont pas faciles à avoir quand il faut les commander. Donc, n'hésitez pas, elle va pouvoir vous les dédicacer. Merci à nos auditeurs en ligne. On est désolé de ne pas pouvoir vous shipper de la bière et du fromage, mais merci d'avoir été avec nous. Et la prochaine fois, n'hésitez pas à vous joindre à nous en personne. On vous souhaite une excellente soirée. Merci beaucoup. Randall says, thank you very much. Anna online, he says, thank you very much. So, on to the 5 à 7.